Hello, and welcome to Counseling Theories, Episode 1, Person-Centered Theory. My name is Dr. Amber Hughes. To kick off this episode, I want to remind you all of the purpose of counseling theories. In counseling, theories give us a framework for understanding people, behavior, the nature of dysfunction or problems, and how we might go about helping people overcome these problems. Some theories, like psychoanalytic, that's Freud's theory, have a well-developed view of human nature, including stages of development. Freud talks about the unconscious mind and goes into detail with lots and lots of things. Other theories, however, focus more on practice. Person-centered is one of those theories that, I believe, spends less time considering human nature and more time on practical applications of the theory. A lot of the information from this lecture comes from the Quarry textbook on counseling theories. Keep in mind that I am talking, so a lot of it comes from me. You should also know that I subscribe to this theory in part, so when I speak to a lot of these things, I'm coming from a place of fully buying into the person-centered framework. My other disclaimer, if you will, is that I'm assuming you are reading the text prior to or in addition to consuming this lecture, so I'm not going to reiterate everything from the textbook. Rather, I am attempting to pull out the high points, synthesize the material in a way that makes sense to me, and hopefully to you, and give you my perspective on the theory as it relates to counseling practice. I'm going to start by talking a bit about the history of the theory. Most textbooks and other resources talk about the history of the theory and the life of the theorist. Why? Well, for me, it helps to remember the theories if I understand the entire story of theoretical developments, and by that I mean when the theories were developed, by who, and kind of what were they coming out of. It also helps to consider the context in which the theory was developed, and by that I also mean when it was developed, but also by who and what that person was coming from, which is more helpful in some theories than others. It makes it easier for me to understand. For some reason, that context makes things easier for me if I can string things together in my brain, so I'm going to include a little bit about that. The person-centered approach was developed by Carl Rogers in the 1940s. What is so interesting about the approach is that it came about in the time when Freudian psychoanalysis was most popular. So Carl Rogers was trained in that way of thinking. Why is that so interesting to me? Well, it kind of goes against, or this theory goes against most everything Freud said. Rogers' view of human nature, the role of the therapist in counseling, the concepts of diagnosis and treatment, and so on, hugely differs from Freud's view. So it's interesting in the development of theories. This one and when we talk about Gestalt both came out of Freud's theories, and both are vastly different from psychoanalysis. It's interesting to me that this new wave of theories coming out of Freud's, and we can't discount what Freud did. You know, certainly he's the father of psychology, but this wave of theories that come out of psychoanalysis are coming from that kind of training, are just kind of taking everything about psychoanalysis and flipping it. Carl Rogers was also influenced by Maslow's hierarchy of needs and concept of self-actualization. So according to Maslow, people innately move towards self-actualization if we are given the opportunity to do so. And he's got like this triangle of his that describes his hierarchy of needs, and at the bottom are basic needs of survival. And he says that we can't really do much with people until the needs are met at each level. Which makes sense as a counselor, because when we're working with people who are struggling with a place to live, they need food, they need water, you're not going to be able to do much counseling until you can meet those basic needs, right? Self-actualization, according to his theory, is at the very top. And so once we've gone through all of the needs that he's identified, then we can get to a point where we're really striving to be self-actualized. And he says that not very many people reach that point. But according to him and according to Rogers, we have that natural, and this is what's really important, we have that natural tendency to grow and to move in a positive way. Rogers, and again, when I refer to Rogers, and I'll probably use Rogers and person-centered interchangeably, because he is the one who has developed this theory. But Rogers' view of human nature also coincides largely with Maslow's concepts of self-actualization. So they say, or the person-centered approach says, that at their core, humans are trustworthy and positive. Humans are capable of making changes and living productive, effective lives. Humans innately gravitate towards self-actualization, and given the right growth-fostering conditions, individuals strive to move forward and fulfill their creative nature. And so you can see that belief in the positive nature of people, and that we will all move forward, right? We're all going to be capable of moving in a positive direction. This idea of human nature seems to make so much sense, right? However, in terms of psychotherapy, it gets a little more complicated because Rogers fully believes that individuals can make positive changes in themselves. So in counseling, the therapist is less directive, less active, and really sees the client as the expert. This seems like a great concept, but it can be a bit more challenging with certain clients, particularly those who are required to attend counseling, who don't see they have a problem, and so on. It's also going to be more challenging with certain populations, people who have done really horrible things. I've got students who say it would be really hard for me to use person-centered or to fully believe in the positive nature of someone who was a child molester or who committed horrible crimes. And so you may find that this is challenging for you. You may find and you'll have the opportunity to watch some examples of person-centered counseling, but I also find that students have a hard time with the person-centered approach in that it's very much client-led, and so the counselor really takes a step back and is very non-directive. What you might find is that, like I mentioned, you pull pieces. I don't even think I mentioned it, did I? So with counseling theories, when you're developing your theory, likely you're not going to fully buy into one theory. You're going to create your own personal theory, and you're pulling from 2 or 3 theories to do so. So you might find some pieces that you like from one theory and some pieces that you have a hard time with. And so that's really what I want you to focus on, is not fully jumping on board with one theory, but saying, hey, I like this. I think this is something that I really fits with my own worldview. Personally, though, I think the person-centered approach is actually more helpful in instances when you're working with super challenging clients, because it allows me to focus on myself and establishing a relationship with the client rather than on developing goals and moving the client towards action. And those are things that some other theories rely more heavily on, is that forward focus and that action. And so when I'm working with, and most of my work has been with at-risk populations, so particularly, I'm thinking when I was working at an alternative school, I had a lot of students who, honestly, some of them just wouldn't talk to me. They didn't trust me. They didn't, they were in extremely challenging circumstances at home. They were involved in some really challenging things like gangs and drugs and whatnot. And so my work with them was less about action, right? There was no action involved with most of my clients, with most of my students, just none. There were no goals. There were no, let's do some nice homework and you're going to come back to me. None of that. The majority of my work was simply building rapport. I had some students where it took me weeks to get them to talk to me. And so taking a person-centered approach was something that honestly kept me sane. So that focus on me, what I am doing, and the belief that the person in front of me can do it themselves really helped me make sense of the work I was doing, because in terms of other theories like cognitive behavioral, I wasn't doing anything. Again, there were no goals. There were no, let's talk about your thoughts and help, I can maybe do some psychoed here. There was none of that. Like I said, a lot of my students were simply not talking, or they were lying, or they were talking about things that that cognitive behavioral theory could not really do much with. talking about home lives, talking about situations that were, again, really challenging, more systemic issues. And so person-centered really helped me in those situations, again, because the frame of reference was about that relationship, and that was what I was able to focus on in my work with them, rather than some of the things that seemed to me to be more action oriented about the other different theories that we use today. All right, moving on to key elements of person-centered. So we have the focus on the therapist more so than the client in this theory. Like I was talking about with psychoanalysis, there's a lot of look given to the client and how we're going to analyze that person. And Rogers says, we don't need to do that. What we need to do is focus on ourselves. So the personal characteristics of the therapist, the quality of the therapeutic relationship, the counselor's creation of a growth-promoting climate, the person's capacity for self-directed growth if involved in a therapeutic relationship. So we're fully focused on ourselves and creating this relationship with our client that allows them to move forward. And it may not be in our session. I think I heard somewhere that most of the work that our clients do goes on outside of the session. And so again, and I think this is something that's really challenging for new counselors, is that idea that we want to do something and we want to see change. And likely, especially with a lot of our clients, you're not going to see change in the session. But if you're focused on this, if you're coming from a person-centered approach and you're focused on that relationship and that climate in the counseling room, you are allowing your client a place for moving forward. For moving forward, that's simply this relationship that we're developing is enough. It's creating enough of and I call it, even a safe place, a safe relationship, to allow you to move towards self-actualization. And so again, going back to some of my students who were in super challenging home lives, they were in foster care, they were involved in gang activity, so a lot of violence and mistrust and those types of things, and by providing, and again, this is totally my take, right? By providing a place, by working on building a relationship with them, my perspective was that I was, first of all, giving them, letting them know that there were people they could trust, right? So demonstrating or giving them an example of someone they could trust when maybe they haven't had that before. And so for me, that was still doing something, okay? And second of all, once we got to a place where they did trust me, it was providing that place, that climate for that self-actualization to occur. Because remember, if we're considering Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we can't do much if our basic needs aren't being met. And so I was certainly doing as much as I could to help them meet their basic needs outside of school, but my ability was limited. But what I could do is say, here in this place, in this school, in this room, your needs are being met. And this is a safe place. And maybe here you can start to do some of that self-actualizing. I'm providing a space for that to occur when it can't occur at home because you are concerned about safety maybe, or you aren't eating as much as you need to eat. So you're focused on those survival needs at home. But at school, we're creating this kind of mini environment to allow you to do a little bit of work on your own, and assuming that this person has the ability to do that work and that growth on their own, but we're providing a place for that to occur, even if it's just for a little bit of time. Does that make any sense? This leads into the counselor or the therapist attributes, which I talked about when we're first looking at empathy in regards to counseling skills. And I mentioned that it comes from person-centered therapy then. But so I'm just going to touch briefly on this. The Rogers identified 3 characteristics. Congruence, which is genuineness or realness. This is where you're noticing your client's feelings and feeling with them. Unconditional positive regard. acceptance, which is acceptance and caring, where you're being authentic or transparent. And then, sorry, I'm looking at this PowerPoint I created and I'm like, I don't think those are quite right. I think I switched some things around. So congruence is really being yourself and being genuine. Just ignore what I said before. So the noticing your client's feelings and feeling with them would be empathy. This is what happens. This is what happens whenever I try to script things more. I can't do it. I mess things up. So I'm just going to talk. Anyway, congruence is being real, right? Being genuine. Your clients know when you're not. They know when you're, and this happens also with like theory. So if you're using a theory you're not comfortable with, or you don't totally buy into, it can come across as being not super congruent. So this is why it's important to really do some theory work. And again, these classes aren't enough. These classes are just giving you a taste. So you really need to do more work on theories, like going to conferences and workshops and reading things about them. Unconditional positive regard. This is the one that a lot of people have a problem with again, certain people who've done certain things that are not good. This is that unconditional belief in the person. And this is the one where I would say it goes back to that belief that the person still has the ability to change. And so that's kind of how I think of it in my mind when I'm working with someone, or when I consider working with someone who has done a lot of things that aren't good. That person still, according to person-centered theory, still has the ability to move forward and to be move in a positive direction. And then finally, accurate empathic understanding. This is the ability to deeply grasp the subjective world of another person. This is where you're noticing your client's feelings and feelings with them. This is something that the Ivy text, if you have looked at it yet, is breaks down a little bit more. Empathy. So there's different ways to do empathy. And they talk about that, the practical aspect of it, but really it is feeling what another person feels. And whenever we take all these together, to me, what we're doing is we're simply putting the client in the role of expert. And so if I am present in the room, if I am listening to you and trying to understand you, I am fully putting you in a position where you're telling me about you, and I can't understand you. And so that unconditional positive regard with challenging people, honestly, for me, I don't know what they've experienced. And so I also come from a place of systemic thinking, right? Of understanding the social and cultural aspects of who we are. And so when I consider certain people who have done things like committed violence, or child molesters and whatnot, they tend to not develop in a vacuum. And so when I'm working with that person, I'm trying to understand how they came to be, with the assumption that that person is still innately good. They've just experienced some things that caused them to act or to be in certain ways that are not positive. Okay. Again, this is my worldview, and I was drawn to person-centered because it fits with my worldview. And so there may be some things that are challenging to you. You may be like, this is total crap, I can't get into this, and that's fine. Just keep in mind that that what you're doing is, it's with these theories, it's like you're trying on different hats, and you're trying on different hats to see what fits your head and to see what looks good on you. And at the end of all of this, you're just, hopefully you're going to find one or two that you're like, I think I could do this. You're not going to fall in love with the theory at the first glance. It takes a long time to really grasp it, first of all, and to get to a place where you understand it, where you have done enough practicing counseling that it starts to make a little bit more sense. All right, moving on. Core conditions required to do person-centered. Two persons are in psychological contact, so you have to be in a relationship with someone. The first, the client is experiencing incongruence in their life. So we talk about congruence as a therapist characteristic. In order for us to do person-centered counseling, there also needs to be some incongruence with the client. And that incongruence can be a lot of things. Likely they are aware of it, or else that wouldn't bring them to the counseling relationship. In terms of people who have maybe been court ordered to see you or required to see you for some reason, that incongruence might be more external, where they think, hey, I'm fine, and the court or the judge is saying, no, you've got a problem, right? So that might simply be the incongruence, and that's a little bit more obvious to us, but a little bit more challenging because the client may not be aware of that incongruence. The second person, the therapist, is congruent or integrated in the relationship, and this is where and why we talk about how important it is that we do our own work as therapists, because we have to be congruent and we have to be mentally healthy in order to do counseling. 4, the therapist experiences unconditional positive regard or real caring for the client. So again, I think this is something I talked about in one of those first counseling skills videos. But in order to really do person-centered, we have to actually have unconditional positive regard. So if you're using this like in conjunction with another theory, you might be able to fake it or pretend or just try really hard. But in order to do real person-centered, you need to actually have unconditional positive regard. 5, the therapist experiences empathy for the client's internal frame of reference and endeavors to communicate this to the client. And again, we demonstrate empathy through a lot of those basic counseling skills, our attending skills, our reflections of feelings, and whatnot. The communication to the client is to a minimal degree achieved, so we have to communicate that empathy at least a little bit in order for this to work. So goals of person-centered. The goal of person-centered is not to solve problems, which is hugely different from what we think of counseling to be, especially when we're first starting off. We're going to fix things. That's what we like to do as helpers. We like to make people feel better, and we're going to fix things. Nope, not with person-centered. Instead, the goal of person-centered is to help clients achieve a greater degree of independence and integration to solve problems on their own. So we're doing work on the client, not on the problem. Okay. This is going to be true for Gestalt as well, and some of the other theories, especially the humanistic theories. It's not so much true with like the more cognitive theories. The work on those theories really takes place on the problems. And so this is why when I'm teaching counseling skills, a lot of times I'll say, no, I don't want to hear any problem solving going on in these we do role plays when I'm teaching counseling skills, especially face-to-face. I'll say no problem solving, and this is one of the reasons why, is because I counsel from a person-centered framework, but also because for any theory to work, we have to understand what's going on first. Okay. So with person-centered in particular, we're focusing on the person and understanding the person. And we're assuming that the person's going to make the change themselves. We just have to help them get to a place where they're healthy and congruent so that they can do the work on their own. Clients in a relationship with a therapist have the ability to set and achieve goals themselves. So I'm not going to do it for them. I'm just there to listen and to help them, again, get to a place where they can start working on these goals. Therapists help clients become more congruent and more able to help themselves. I think of person-centered counseling as like a mirror, a really clear mirror. Okay. And so I am that mirror for you. And I am going to accurately reflect back things that you're telling me so that it becomes clearer to you. So maybe my client has been looking at a mirror that's foggy, or they're short like me and they can only see, the mirror's too high and they can only see the top of their head, or the mirror's one of those ones that's kind of bent and folded, so you get back like a twisted image of yourself, or it's broken and you just see parts of yourself. That's that, and this is like totally me. okay, the way I think about person-centered. So if it makes no sense, then just throw it away. But for me, that's what incongruence is. So you have someone coming in and they're looking at themselves, and the image that they're seeing, it isn't right. It's broken, or it's twisted, or it's foggy, or it's just a partial image, and they're having a hard time seeing past it. And then they come and talk to a person-centered therapist, and that therapist becomes that mirror that helps them see things clearly and make sense of things so that they can then do the work themselves. Okay. I also have one more metaphor, because this is also how I think of person-centered. You know, when you're, so this happens all the time in my household. You know, when you're looking for something and you look and you look and you look and you can't find it, and you know it's there, you just can't seem to find it. And then you ask someone else for help and they find it right away, and it turns out that what you were looking for was there in front of you the whole time. Sometimes I think we can get too close to a problem or too close to something that we can't really see what's going on. And for me, that's also what person-centered therapy is. It's that extra person, that extra set of eyes coming in and saying, hey, it was right there in front of you the whole time. And that's what person-centered is. It's not me telling you what to do, or me helping you figure things out, or me helping you goal set. It's me helping you understand yourself so that you can come in and say, hey, you're right. It was there the whole time. I just couldn't see it because I was too close to the problem, or I couldn't see it because there were so many things going on in my life. They were causing that image to be blurred. And then directly from the Corey text, the therapy relationship provides a supportive structure within which clients' self-healing capacities are activated. Okay. Moving on to practice, the practical applications of the theory. The therapist and the therapeutic relationship are the things that bring about change. So in person-centered, there are not a whole lot of techniques other than the basic counseling skills. There's no empty chair technique. There's no dream analysis. There's none of that. None of that with person-centered. It's just you and me, and I'm using basic skills. There are techniques. There's creative techniques that we'll talk about in a minute, but those are still based on the basic counseling skills. Particularly the basic counseling skills that are focused on helping the client get to deeper meaning and understanding, paraphrasing, summarizing, reflection of feelings, reflection of meaning. So those skills that are really putting things back. So you're taking your client's own words and you're putting them back on them. Remember, think of that mirror metaphor. Is it a metaphor? Analogy? I don't know. If you know, insert the correct word. But think of that mirror, right? We're reflecting back. I don't have questions here because in person-centered, you might use questions. You're going to use them sparingly, though, because questions require some direction, right? So a question requires me to think and to guide you. So you're going to guide your clients with paraphrasing, with summaries and whatnot. You're still going to guide them. What you're doing, though, is likely guiding them deeper. Questions can guide someone deeper, but they can also guide someone in a different direction, in a direction that's more where you want them to go, where the therapist wants them to go, if that makes any sense. And so you're going to use questions a little bit less with person-centered. You're going to rely more on these skills here with the person-centered counseling. Connections to creativity. So person-centered expressive arts therapy was developed by Natalie Rogers, Carl Rogers' daughter. Why do we use creativity, or why could we or should we use creativity in counseling? And just a side note, creativity is a big part of counseling. When we first talk about counseling, we talk about it as a combination of both science and art, right? So there are a lot of creative components to it. And here are some of the reasons why you ought to consider using some creativity in counseling. First of all, according to Natalie Rogers, all people have an innate ability to be creative. And if you think about creativity less as like being an artist and more, I read it, I don't have Heather Trepaul, I believe, was the one who quoted this, and she stated this in Counseling Today. There was a Counseling Today article on creativity. She said that creativity is more like outside the box thinking. Okay, so we all have the ability to think outside the box. It's just that some people need a little bit of help to do so. So there are various creative art forms that are used to promote healing, self-discovery, self-awareness, and insight. Creative expression connects us to our feelings, which are a source of life energy. It's hard to be creative and not be personal. And I think that's why a lot of people have a hard time creating things, because you're putting a little bit of yourself on the paper and you're giving it to someone else. And that's really hard, right? So I do a lot of writing. A lot of it's these days is on research, but it's still hard. I just wrote a paper by myself for the first time. Most of the time I collaborate with other people, and I wrote that paper all by myself, and it was so hard to submit it to a journal to review for publication. So much harder than a paper that I had collaborated with other people on, because it was so personal. This is something it was about creativity, actually. But it's something that's so personal to me, something that I'm really, really feel strongly about, and it was my own words and my own work, and I put a lot of effort into it, and it was very personal. Okay, so that's what creativity does. It takes a little bit of our personal selves and it puts us out there, which can be it can be hard, and it make us a little bit vulnerable. But both of those things are therapeutic, and they're particularly therapeutic in terms of person-centered. Individuals explore new facets of the self and uncover insights that transform them, creating wholeness. So again, that focus on helping the person become more themselves with person-centered, and we can do that through creativity. And finally, when we use creativity, the client's inner world and outer world can become unified. And so a lot of times, especially if it's something that's maybe not super familiar with them, if you're using something, and that's why creativity is helpful too. Because if you're having a client, especially an adult client, color, right, with crayons. I say crayons because people say crayons differently, right? And they say color differently depending on the region. So I felt I needed to clarify. You're like, what is she talking about? If I'm not using the right accent on color. Anyway, sorry. Side note. If you're asking an adult to color a picture, or to just, one of my favorite creative techniques regarding feelings is to just, I want you to fill the page with color, and each color represents a different feeling. And so when you're forcing your client to move outside his or her comfort zone, likely because not too many adults color, right? And then they have to, right? They have to put some feelings out there. They have to do something. Sometimes I'll put a limit on it. You need to use at least 4 feelings. And so they're taking what's inside themselves and they're putting it on paper. But what's cool about using activities like this, like creative activities, is that it does put, it helps your clients put themselves out there, but it does so in a way that there's like, and this is how I think of it, like a mediator, right? So it's now on the paper. And so it's easier for me to talk about this on the paper than it is for me to talk about what's inside me. And so while we're working for that unification, right, we're working for that inner world and outer world to become unified, sometimes it's hard to get what's inside us out, and putting it on paper can help to do so, right? It can put it there. So it's there in front of me, and I can talk about it easier than when it's here in my head, if that makes sense. And so creativity works really well within person-centered therapy. Now, you don't necessarily you can use creativity with any theory, okay? So keep that in mind. Natalie Rogers specifically talks about using it with person-centered theory. And again, I feel like it fits really well within person-centered theory. But I certainly encourage you to consider using creativity within any theoretical framework, because I think that it's just really powerful and really helpful with our work, especially, and I would say especially with kids, because kids, I think, are more drawn to those types of things, but also with adults. I have never taught a class for counseling students where I have not done creativity. So I use creativity on my classes, my face-to-face classes, and every single class that I have, they love it. They'll love it. They love taking a break and coloring or being creative or doing something that's not I'm just going to sit here and listen, or I'm going to sit here and talk. So it really helps to break things up, I think, whether you're teaching or in counseling. And then finally, I want to take a look at the theory in terms of diversity. So some strengths. The person-centered theory has had a major impact on the field of human relations with diverse cultural groups because we're going to the person first and listening to them. Roger's work has reached more than 30 countries, and his writings have been translated into 12 languages. The therapist is viewed as a fellow explorer who attempts to understand the client's phenomenological world in an interested and accepting and open way. Some weaknesses. Clients who expect a directive counselor may be put off by this unstructured approach, and I experience this a lot with adolescents. Because they want you to come in and fix things, especially when we're talking about specific problems. They expect a counselor to be more directive, and so it can be a challenge to help kind of change their way of thinking about counseling. It is difficult to translate the core therapeutic conditions into actual practice in certain cultures, and the focus on individual autonomy and personal growth may be viewed as selfish in cultures that stress the common good, so those collectivist cultures. I'm going to end with a metaphor used in the Corey text. So consider an oak tree. Once the seed is planted, the tree will grow. If the sun is blocked, the tree continues to grow towards light, changing its shape if need be. There may be times that the tree's growth becomes stunted because of a lack of water or lack of light. And those times, someone can come in to help the tree by giving it water or removing the thing blocking the sun. But the tree still knows how to grow on its own. It doesn't need to be told how to do so. This is how the person-centered therapist views the individual. The person in front of us has the innate ability to grow and move forward in a positive direction. We maybe can help facilitate this growth, but we are just there to help the person better understand his or her own ability to change, not to facilitate the change itself. So again, we're focusing on the individual with person-centered and helping them become a more whole person rather than on fixing or solving any problems that the person has. Our assumption is that they can do it themselves.